There are moments in life when everything seems blocked. No matter how hard you try, things don't flow. Opportunities disappear, relationships fail, money slips away, and your energy feels drained. And you begin to wonder, is something wrong with me? Some people call it bad luck. Others call it a curse. But the truth is far simpler and far more powerful. What you place at the center of your life determines the direction of your destiny. And when I say pon esto en tu ombligo, I'm not talking about a mystical object or a ritual. I'm talking about what you allow to sit at the center of your emotional and mental world. Your navel represents connection. It was the first place through which you receive life. Symbolically, it is the point where dependence ends and responsibility begins. If you keep fear there, fear will guide you. If you keep guilt there, guilt will control you. If you keep self-doubt there, doubt will poison every decision you make. Most so-called maldiciones are not external. They are internal permissions you never revoked. You were taught to obey before understanding, to please before respecting yourself, to endure before questioning. Over time, these lessons turned into invisible chains. Not because someone wanted to hurt you, but because nobody taught you how to free yourself. When you place self-respect at the center of your life, something breaks. When you place emotional responsibility there, something dissolves. When you place self-worth there, something ends forever. That's when the curse disappears. Think about how easily we give power to things we don't fully understand. When something goes wrong repeatedly, the mind looks for explanations that remove responsibility from our hands. It's comforting to believe that an external force is working against us, because if the problem is outside, then we don't have to look inward. But most of the time, what we call a curse is nothing more than a pattern we have allowed to settle into our life. And patterns survive only when they are fed. No one enters your life with absolute power over you. That power is granted little by little through silence, tolerance, fear, and habit. It begins the first time you ignore a red flag because you don't want to be alone. It grows when you stay quiet instead of expressing discomfort. It strengthens every time you accept what hurts you and call it patience. Without realizing it, you sign an emotional contract that says, "This is what I deserve." And life takes you seriously. Beliefs are powerful, but not because they are mystical. They are powerful because they guide behavior. If deep inside you believe that you are destined to suffer, you will unconsciously choose situations that confirm that belief. If you believe that love must hurt, you will confuse intensity with affection. If you believe that sacrifice is the price of acceptance, you will always give more than you receive. None of this is imposed from outside. It is self-perpetuated, and that is why it feels inescapable. What people call a curse is often just an unexamined loyalty to old ideas. Ideas learned in childhood, absorbed from family, culture, or past relationships. Endure, don't complain, be grateful, even if it hurts. These messages were not meant to harm you, but they were never meant to rule your adult life either. When you carry them without questioning, they turn into rules that punish you from within. There is a quiet moment when everything changes, and it doesn't look dramatic. It happens when you realize that you have been participating in your own suffering. Not because you wanted pain, but because you didn't know another way. This realization can feel uncomfortable, even painful, because it removes the illusion of being a victim of fate. But it also returns something essential to you: control. Responsibility is not blame. Blame crushes. Responsibility empowers. The moment you understand that no curse survives without your consent, you also understand that freedom begins where consent ends. You don't need to fight invisible enemies. You don't need rituals or protection from imagined forces. You need awareness, courage, and the willingness to stop repeating what no longer serves you. Every time you choose yourself without guilt, something weakens. Every time you say no without explaining yourself, something breaks. Every time you walk away from what diminishes you, a chain falls to the ground. This is not rebellion, it is self-respect in action. And self-respect is incompatible with curses. Life starts to shift when you stop asking, why does this always happen to me? And start asking, what am I allowing that keeps this alive? That question is not cruel, it is honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is the beginning of clarity. There is a reason the image of the navel feels so powerful, even if we don't consciously think about it. It is the first place where life reached you, the point through which everything essential arrived before you could choose anything for yourself. Later it became a scar that quietly reminds you of something fundamental. There was a time when you depended completely on others, and there came a moment when that dependence had to end. Emotionally, many people never complete that transition, and that is where confusion begins. When we speak about placing something at the center, we are talking about what organizes your inner world. Every person has an invisible axis around which their decisions rotate. For some it is fear, for others approval. For many, it is the desperate need to avoid rejection at any cost. Whatever sits there doesn't shout, it whispers. And because it feels familiar, it feels safe. Even when it is harmful, if fear occupies that center, you will choose safety over truth. You will stay where you don't belong, because leaving feels more frightening than suffering. If approval lives there, you will measure your worth by how others respond to you, adjusting yourself until you are barely recognizable. If guilt takes that place, you will constantly feel indebted, as if living fully requires permission you never receive. The problem is not that these emotions exist, the problem is that they rule. Emotions are meant to inform, not govern. When they become the axis of your life, they distort reality. You begin to confuse discomfort with danger, disagreement with abandonment, and boundaries with selfishness. From that confusion, entire life paths are built. Placing self-responsibility at the center does not mean becoming cold or detached. It means understanding that your emotional life is yours to manage. Nobody else can regulate your fears, your needs, or your limits. Expecting others to do so is another form of emotional dependence, and dependence always demands a price. Often that price is your peace. The center is where decisions are filtered. When clarity occupies that place, your choices become simpler, even if they are not easier. You stop negotiating with what violates you. You stop explaining yourself to those who have already decided not to understand you. You stop chasing signs and start listening to signals, those quiet internal warnings you used to ignore. Many people wait for a dramatic event to justify change, a betrayal, a collapse, a deep wound. But maturity begins earlier, in subtle awareness. It begins when you notice the tightness in your chest before saying yes, the exhaustion after certain conversations, the constant anxiety that follows specific environments. These are not coincidences, they are information. When you place awareness at the center, your body and mind begin to work together instead of against each other. This is why changing what sits at the center feels uncomfortable at first. The old center was familiar, even if it hurt. The new one demands presence and honesty. It asks you to tolerate temporary loneliness instead of chronic dissatisfaction. It asks you to disappoint others rather than abandon yourself. And that is a difficult trait for those who were taught that being loved requires constant self-sacrifice. But something remarkable happens when you persist. Your reactions slow down. Your tolerance for nonsense decreases. Your attraction patterns change. You are no longer magnetized by chaos or intensity disguised as passion. Calm stops feeling boring and starts feeling safe. That is not a loss of excitement. It is the recovery of stability. What you place at the center shapes the life you recognize as normal. Change the center, and what once felt inevitable begins to feel optional. Change the center, and what once controlled you becomes irrelevant. Fear, guilt, and self-doubt rarely arrive as enemies. They enter quietly, disguised as protection, loyalty, or humility. Fear tells you it is keeping you safe. Guilt tells you it is keeping you good. Self-doubt tells you it is keeping you realistic. And because their intentions seem reasonable, you rarely question the damage they cause over time. Yet when these emotions become permanent residents, they stop protecting and start imprisoning. Fear is not a problem. Living under its command is. Fear is meant to alert you to real danger, not to dictate every choice you make. But when fear becomes chronic, it narrows your life. You begin to avoid conversations, opportunities, and decisions, not because they are harmful, but because they are uncomfortable. You delay, you hesitate, you wait for the right moment, which never arrives. Slowly, your world shrinks, and you call it stability, when in truth it is emotional confinement. Guilt works in a similar way, but it is even more deceptive. It often masquerades as kindness. You feel guilty for saying no, for prioritizing yourself, for wanting more than what is offered. Somewhere along the way, you learn that taking care of yourself might hurt others, and that belief turned into an internal rule: your needs come last. Over time, guilt teaches you to over-explain, overgive, and over-tolerate. You become emotionally exhausted, yet strangely responsible for everyone else's comfort. Self-doubt completes the triangle. It questions your perceptions, minimizes your instincts, and convinces you that you are exaggerating. When something feels wrong, self-doubt whispers that you are too sensitive. When you want to leave, it suggests you are incapable of doing better. When you feel mistreated, it asks if you are asking for too much. This internal dialogue erodes trust in yourself, and once that trust is gone, you rely increasingly on external validation to decide what is real. Together, these three emotions create a powerful cycle of self-sabotage. Fear keeps you from acting. Guilt keeps you from setting boundaries. Self-doubt keeps you from trusting your decisions. And when life doesn't change, you assume the problem is fate, bad luck, or something outside your control. In reality, the sabotage is internal, repeated daily through small choices that feel insignificant but are not. The most dangerous part is that this process feels familiar. If you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, silence was rewarded, or obedience was praised more than authenticity, these emotions feel normal. You may even confuse them with maturity. You call endurance strength. You call silence peace. You call self-neglect generosity. But emotional maturity does not require you to disappear. Breaking this cycle does not require a dramatic yes to res. It begins with noticing. Noticing when fear speaks louder than desire. Noticing when guilt appears without a real moral reason. Noticing when self-doubt overrides your lived experience. Awareness weakens these emotions because it removes their invisibility. Once seen, they lose authority. Then comes the harder part: choosing differently. Acting despite fear when no real danger exists. Saying no without apologizing excessively. Trusting your perception even when others dismiss it. These choices feel uncomfortable because they go against long-standing habits. But discomfort is not a sign of error. It is a sign of reconditioning. As fear loosens its grip, you start to experience a new sensation: expansion. You speak more honestly. You take up more space. You risk being misunderstood instead of misunderstood in silence. As guilt softens, your energy returns. You stop carrying emotional burdens that were never yours to begin with. And as self-doubt fades, clarity emerges. You no longer need constant reassurance because you begin to trust your internal compass again. This is how emotional prisons dissolve. Not through force, but through consistency. Each small act of self-respect chips away at walls that once felt permanent. What once controlled you becomes background noise. What once paralyzed you becomes information, not instruction. Self-betrayal is one of the quietest, most insidious forms of suffering because it disguises itself as care, patience, or responsibility. Most people do not wake up thinking, "Today I will harm myself emotionally." Instead, it happens in small, nearly imperceptible ways, day after day, until the accumulation becomes overwhelming. Saying yes when every fiber of your being wants to say no. Staying in situations that drain you, tolerating disrespect, postponing your own needs. These are the ways we betray ourselves without realizing it. And the more we do it, the more it feels normal, almost unavoidable, as if the weight on our shoulders is simply the gravity of life itself. The root of self-betrayal is often fear, fear of confrontation, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. Fear whispers that choosing yourself is selfish or dangerous. Fear tells you to endure, to compromise, to remain silent, even when your instincts scream otherwise. And because fear feels protective, we trust it. Yet in reality, it is a prison disguised as safety. Every time you act out of fear rather than conviction, you feed the very patterns that keep you feeling stuck, powerless, or cursed. Guilt often joins fear in this quiet sabotage. You feel guilty for putting your needs first, for protecting your boundaries, or for walking away from what no longer serves you. The world may have taught you that sacrifice equals love, and so you carry this lesson forward, even when it erodes your sense of worth. You end up exhausted, resentful, and disconnected from yourself, yet still searching for approval outside. You are loyal to everyone except the person who matters most, you. Self-betrayal also thrives in the form of habitual avoidance. You convince yourself that tomorrow will be different, that circumstances will change, or that the right time will come. But tomorrow never arrives with guarantees, and waiting often becomes a lifetime of deferred dreams. Every postponed decision, every ignored red flag, and every tolerated insult reinforces a pattern that tells your subconscious, I do not matter enough to protect myself. And the world responds accordingly, because our inner scripts shape our outer reality. What makes self-betrayal particularly painful is how subtle it is. It rarely arrives as a loud, dramatic mistake. Instead, it whispers in the pauses between words, in the hesitation before action, in the silent agreements we make with circumstances that diminish us. Over time, these whispers accumulate into a cacophony that clouds judgment, distorts perception, and keeps us trapped in cycles of disappointment. And when life goes wrong, we point outward, blaming luck, fate, or other people, never realizing that the real source of the curse was our repeated surrender to emotional habits that no longer serve us. The antidote is deceptively simple but challenging conscious self-loyalty. It begins with awareness, honestly recognizing where you have been compromising your values, tolerating disrespect, or silencing your needs. Awareness alone weakens the hold of habitual betrayal because it breaks the autopilot that has guided so many choices. Once you can see the pattern, you gain the power to interrupt it. Next comes action. Awareness without action is like knowing a road is dangerous but continuing to walk blindfolded. Action is choosing yourself in concrete ways, saying no without apology, leaving relationships that harm you, claiming time for your own growth, speaking your truth even when it may upset others. Each act of self-loyalty sends a signal to your subconscious, I am worth protecting. I deserve integrity. And with repeated practice, the patterns that once felt inevitable begin to dissolve. Self-betrayal is also an invitation to redefine what courage means. Courage is not only facing external challenges, it is honoring your inner boundaries. Even when doing so feels uncomfortable or lonely, it is confronting years of learned habits, emotional debts, and internalized rules that instructed you to put everyone first. Courage is quiet, persistent, and often invisible to others, but its effects ripple through every aspect of life. Finally, letting go of self-betrayal restores a sense of agency that many believe has been lost. When you stop tolerating what diminishes you, life starts to respond differently. People who once took advantage of your compliance sense the change, and circumstances that used to hold you back lose their grip. Freedom does not arrive as a spectacular event. It arrives as a series of daily choices, small acts of loyalty to yourself that add up to transformation. Self-respect is more than a polite idea or a nice word we toss around. It is the foundation of emotional freedom. Without it, everything we do is filtered through compromise, fear, or obligation. Many people confuse tolerance for virtue, endurance for strength, and sacrifice for love, but these are illusions that hide the quiet erosion of dignity. Self-respect is what allows you to live with integrity, make decisions without fear of judgment, and step into life without apology. It is not arrogance, it is awareness of your worth and the refusal to settle for anything less than what aligns with it. Boundaries are the practical expression of self-respect. They are not walls to keep others out. They are signals that tell the world what is acceptable and what is not. Setting a boundary may feel uncomfortable at first. You may fear conflict or disapproval. You may worry that others will think you are selfish. But these fears are precisely the reason boundaries are necessary. They protect your emotional ecosystem, and in doing so, they eliminate the conditions that once allowed suffering to take root. ESTO, time. You enforce a boundary. You teach yourself and others that your peace is not negotiable. Self-respect also transforms your relationships. People who lack it often attract those who exploit compliance, manipulate guilt, or thrive on control. The same patterns repeat because the invisible signal you send says, I will tolerate disrespect because my needs are secondary. When self-respect grows, that signal changes. You no longer attract people who diminish you. You stop tolerating behavior that once felt inevitable, and you begin to interact from a place of clarity, not fear. Relationships become reciprocal, not transactional. They are chosen, not endured. Moreover, self-respect changes how you relate to your own choices. Without it, every decision carries doubt and regret. You wonder if you are doing the right thing, constantly measuring your actions against external expectations. When self-respect anchors you, your decisions are guided by integrity, not by the anxiety of approval or the weight of imagined consequences. You do not act to please or avoid conflict, you act to honor yourself. That alignment creates a clarity that feels like liberation. The practice of self-respect is cumulative. It begins with small acts, refusing to engage in conversations that demean you, saying no when your intuition resists, leaving spaces where you are undervalued. Each act may feel minor, but their repetition rewires your sense of self. Over time, the inner voice that once doubted, apologized excessively, or justified mistreatment begins to quiet. What once felt like compromise begins to feel unnecessary. What once required negotiation now feels natural. Self-respect is also a form of protection against external curses or misfortune. When you value yourself and enforce your boundaries, negative influences lose their power. Manipulation, criticism, and toxic energy cannot penetrate the armor of someone who refuses to betray their own standards. You do not need rituals, spells, or external validation. Your inner integrity alone is enough to neutralize forces that once seemed overwhelming. Life respects the person who respects themselves. It is important to recognize that self-respect is not a one-time achievement. It is a lifelong practice. Old habits, past betrayals, and learned patterns can attempt to reassert themselves. Fear may resurface, guilt may whisper, and self-doubt may creep in. But each time you return to the practice, reinforcing boundaries, honoring your needs, prioritizing your peace, you strengthen the foundation that cannot be shaken. What was once a cycle of suffering becomes a spiral of growth. When self-respect occupies the center of your life, the curses of your past no longer define you. Emotional chains weaken, and the patterns that once held you captive dissolve naturally. You begin to move through life with a quiet authority, unshaken by chaos and undeterred by those who would diminish you. Decisions that once felt impossible become clear. Choices that once terrified you become opportunities. Peace, stability, and dignity are no longer distant ideals. They are lived experience. Self-respect is not an act of defiance against the world. It is an act of fidelity to yourself. It is the recognition that your life deserves integrity, that your energy is valuable, and that your presence matters. The moment you claim it fully, the illusions that once dominated your life, patterns of dependence, fear, and compromise, fade into irrelevance. Transformation is rarely about dramatic gestures or sudden breakthroughs. Most often it is the result of consistent, deliberate choices that align your life with clarity, integrity, and awareness. The shift that makes a curse powerless does not happen because something external changes, but because you change from within. It begins when you stop waiting for luck, for someone else to intervene, or for circumstances to become ideal, and start taking full responsibility for your emotional world. True transformation is the moment you realize that your life is not happening to you. It is happening through you. Awareness is the first step. It is not enough to hope things will improve or to wish for a I-Fei without obstacles. You must notice the patterns that repeat in your life, the small decisions that accumulate into larger consequences. Observe where you give your power away, where fear dictates your choices, and where self-doubt undermines your instincts. This awareness may be uncomfortable at first because it forces you to confront the parts of yourself you have ignored or denied. But discomfort is the doorway to growth. Without seeing clearly, you cannot change consciously. Once awareness is established, the next step is deliberate action. Transformation is the practice of making choices that reinforce your autonomy. It means saying no when a situation diminishes you, even if saying no risks confrontation or disappointment. It means walking away from relationships, habits, or environments that drain your energy, even if leaving feels lonely. It means stopping the repetition of behaviors that reinforce suffering and choosing instead what nourishes your self-respect, dignity, and peace. Every small act of conscious choice is a brick in the foundation of a new life. Consistency is essential. Change does not occur overnight because the patterns you are replacing have often been in place for years. Fear, guilt, and self-doubt are persistent. They will try to reassert themselves, whispering that old habits were safer, that familiar suffering is more predictable, that stepping into your own power is dangerous. Transformation requires resisting these voices repeatedly, day after day, in both minor and major decisions. Each time you choose differently, the old pattern weakens and the new one strengthens. Over time, these small choices accumulate into profound, lasting change. Another critical aspect of transformation is integration. It is not enough to make changes in isolated areas of life. True transformation requires that your inner world and your external actions align. You cannot claim freedom internally while tolerating disrespect externally. You cannot say you value yourself while allowing toxic influences to persist in your life. Integration means consistency between thought, emotion, and behavior. When your actions reflect your values, the sense of personal power becomes tangible. The life that once felt chaotic begins to feel coherent and responsive to your presence. Transformation also invites patience. It is natural to expect instant results and to become frustrated when old habits linger. But every lasting change requires time for internal recalibration. Just as a seed does not become a tree overnight, the shifts within your emotional and mental landscape need steady nurturing. Patience is not passive, it is active persistence. The steady reinforcement of new beliefs, new behaviors, and new boundaries, even when results are not immediately visible. Finally, transformation is profoundly liberating. When your internal compass guides your decisions, when self-respect occupies your center, and when emotional responsibility becomes your default mode, the illusions that once dominated your life, the sense of being cursed, trapped, or powerless, dissolve naturally. You no longer need rituals, magic, or external interventions. Life begins to respond differently, not because the world has changed, but because you have changed. You act from clarity, not reaction. You respond with discernment, not fear. You navigate relationships, challenges, and opportunities with a sense of authority and peace that once seemed impossible. The power of transformation lies in its subtlety. It is not a spectacle. It is the quiet, steady reclamation of your life. Each conscious decision, each moment of self-respect, each boundary enforced, and each act of courage compounds to create a new reality. Over time, what once seemed like a curse becomes irrelevant, because your presence, choices, and awareness now define your life.